And cut!
Carry on. Take your seats, please. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Well, today we have a very special guest for our graduation ceremony. I consider this very, very fortunate considering today's time. If you've been reading the newspaper or you've been watching CNN, you know we have many children today that are lost, looking for heroes, looking for role models. Oftentimes they turn into VH1, MTV, Sports Illustrated, ESPN. Today, we have a gentleman that's very much like you and I. American citizen, family man, dad, granddad, husband, a real American hero. I give you Sergeant First Class Samuel L. Davis, Congressional Medal of Honor winner.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. It's an honor for me to be here with the graduation. I congratulate all of you for the hard work that's brought you to this point, and it makes me very proud to be able to be here with you today. One of the first questions that is usually asked of me is, well, how did I earn this Medal of Honor? And Medal of Honors are always earned. On the night of November the 18th, 1967, I was artillery. The artillery's job is to provide close and continuous support for the infantry. And we were moved out to a forward fire support base named Cudgel to support the infantry. We arrived there about 8 o'clock in the morning. There were 42 of us on that operation, artillerymen. We did our job in support of the infantry all day. Towards dusk, a helicopter landed, and a major walked out and informed us that our probability of getting hit that night was 100%. He did not say to what extent that we were going to get hit, but he guaranteed us that it was 100%. So after firing a 105 howitzer, y'all can see the big round there on the table. That's a 105. I believe it weighs 97 pounds. And after humping them all day, you can imagine that your arms were tired and your back was sore. So we first naturally cleaned up our howitzer, swabbed the tube, make sure everything was squared away there, got our rounds fixed, cut charges, getting ready to fire the next day or that night if need be, and stacked all of our rounds up like good soldiers are supposed to, neat and orderly. Cut our powder charges, had the powder bags. The charges in those come in little bags of various size, and in a 105 howitzer there's 7 little bags, 7 charges, and you determine how far you shoot by the angle of your tube and by how many powder charges you have in it. So we'd been shooting charge 5 all day, and we went ahead and cut a few rounds with that same loading in case there was a hot mission come down we had to immediately fire. So we had loose powder in the bag stacked up alongside the howitzer and the rounds. Everything went well until 2 o'clock in the morning. We had been taking 2-hour shifts as far as being on the radio and then sleeping for 2 hours on, 2 hours off. The man that was on the radio from 12 till 2 was Marvin Hart, and at about 1:45, he came over to wake me up, which I wasn't really sleeping that hard because it was very hot and the mosquitoes was bad, and when you're in a situation like that, you don't really sleep that great. So he came over to wake me up, and I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Well, I'm afraid that I'm going to go to sleep, so either change places with me or set up with me." And I said, "Well, I'll go ahead and take over your guard." Well, it took him a few minutes for him to unwind, to be able to, go lay down in the mud hole to go to sleep. And at 2 o'clock sharp, we heard mortars sliding down the tube. And once you hear that sound, it's very distinctive, and especially when it's very, very close to you. And they were approximately within 50 meters of our location, dropping mortars in on us. So high angle. So from the time they went bloop until the time they landed, seemed like a long time. 40 seconds maybe, I don't know. And I asked Hart, well, when did they move mortars in? And he said they didn't. Normal mortar attack in Vietnam was 3 to 5 rounds. Basically just a harassment type situation, especially during the night. Basically what they wanted to do was just to keep you from sleeping. Because I guarantee you, if you got 2 or 3 rounds of mortar in the middle of the night, you didn't sleep the rest of the night. So that's what we were hoping that it was. When it went beyond the average 3 to 5 rounds to 15 or 20 rounds, we knew that something unique was coming up. And after the mortars had come down on us for 15 or 20 minutes solid, we knew that it was indeed going to be something special. So we were trying to crawl around amidst the mortar fire and secure the last-minute details that you always think you're going to have all the time in the world to do. When you know that something of this magnitude is coming, all these things go through your mind, and you want to make sure that you have that extra ammunition or whatever. At 2:30 sharp, we heard whistles being blown, like the whistles that coaches use. We heard bugles blowing, and we heard orders being shouted in American, in English, which was supposed to have a psychological effect on us, which it did, and they did that on purpose because of, well, for one thing, we could hear them say, attack and kill the American GIs. So that had its desired effect upon us. Most of the, not most, a good deal of the NVA officers were educated in Harvard, Stanford, Paris. They were much better educated than we were. So when they started shouting and blowing the bugles and the whistles, they started forming wave attacks, which they had at least 20 North Chinese advisors with them. And the North Chinese tactic of warfare has always been is to simply overwhelm. And they were running at us in waves of 150 to 200 at a time would come running at your position. You can only pull the trigger so many times, and their ideal of just massing up and coming at you under most conditions would succeed. But because of our main weapon, which was the 105 howitzer, and each one of those rounds that you see standing up, the big round on the table, in a beehive round there's 18,000 flechette darts, which are 1.25 inches long, the diameter of a pencil lead, and look very much like a very small arrow. So our sergeant said, boys, this is it. And we jumped up out of our foxhole, loaded a beehive round. We had, as a crew, we moved the gun, lowered the tube to where we thought it would do the most good. I was waiting for my sergeant. I was the man that fired the piece. I was the assistant gunner. And I was waiting for my sergeant to give me the word to fire. And I was trying to make myself very small. The 105 howitzer, I don't know if any of you ever seen it, but the shields on the side, it's basically an open gun. There's nothing there. They have these small shields. And I was trying to make myself very small and hide behind this shield with a lanyard in my hand looking at my sergeant, waiting for him to tell me to fire. And when he told me to fire, I pulled the lanyard, and what I didn't know at that moment was that there was a rocket set up across the river from us, which the river was about 25 meters across, and we were right on the riverbank. When I fired the piece, they fired the rocket at my muzzle blast, and it hit the shield that I was hiding behind and went right underneath my arm and struck my sergeant right the chest. So this all happened instantaneously. So I pulled the lanyard and my sergeant disappeared. It looked like he had fire coming out of his chest. Disappeared backwards. The next thing I knew, I was laying, I remember rolling over and falling into my foxhole. I thought that I had been laying in fire ants, because we had fire ants over there. Y'all got fire ants here, right? So y'all, if you've ever been into them, you know what it feels like. As soon as I rolled over, I was just burning real bad, and I thought, well, I must be in fire ants, so I was trying to wipe them off of me. And as I would roll up on my side, I could see, I couldn't hear anything yet because of the explosion, but when I'd roll up on my side, the sandbags would start disappearing. You know, I couldn't hear it yet, but I could see this happening, so I'd try to lay flat, try to get those fire ants off, and we started getting illumination. And I was trying to wipe what I thought was fire ants off and brought my hand up, and I could see that there was blood all over it. And I said, well, I've been hit. As my head cleared, the smoke got out of my head and I could start thinking. My hearing started coming back. I don't know how long this time period was. I don't think it was more than just a few minutes before I could actually start hearing a little bit. I tried to take my flak jacket off because I still thought I had fire ants on me. I didn't know that I'd been shot by beehive round. Got my flak jacket off, and as a process of peeling it off, well, I could see from the light from the flare these metal darts sticking out of it. And that's when I realized that I'd been hit by beehive, but I thought that the enemy had beehive. I didn't know it was my guys. And what had happened was that after our gun had gotten hit, the crew that was still alive fell back to the next piece, and they left me, thought that I was dead, because that shield is high tensile steel. And when that rocket hit it, it just disintegrated into thousands of little bitty pieces. And I was bent over like this here, so they said I looked like hamburger. And it blew me into my foxhole, which was about this far from the gun. And my backside was facing our next gun. So when the NVA started turning my piece around to fire a beehive round or whatever they could get at our guys, my guy shot a beehive round over my position. And that's what hit me. And when that hit me, well, then I rolled over into the foxhole. And I had, well, when I got to the hospital, I had about 30 left in me. And I was picking out those that I could feel, you know. So after laying there for a few minutes and getting my thoughts together, I would rise up and look out across the river, and I could see them waiting on the other bank, waiting to wade into the river. The river was about 9 to 10 foot deep, maybe 12 foot, so it wasn't a really deep river, but you couldn't wade across it, you had to swim. And they would put their weapons on their back and then look like what they were breaststroking across. And then when they would get to my side, which was, I was about this close to the riverbank, they were getting up and opening their breech, let the water run out of the barrel, putting a round in it, and shooting. So I knew I had to do something very quickly. I had an M16 in my foxhole. I had about 14 clips in my foxhole. I think the average standard load was about 7 clips is what they gave you, and I had scrounged a few extra clips. I had run out of ammunition earlier in Vietnam, and that's a very terrifying feeling to be in a war with no ammunition. So I always packed as many clips as I could with me. I fired the M16 until I ran out of ammunition. It reminded me of when I was a kid and my dad would take me to the carnivals and those little ducks that would float by, and you'd shoot them with BB guns or 22s or whatever. And that's what I related it to. because they were just, the river was thick with people trying to come over and kill me. So I would pick them off as they would come across the river. And when I ran out of ammunition, well, it hadn't slowed them down a lot. There were still people within 8-10 foot of me, and I knew I had to do something else. Well, I had 4 boxes of M60 machine gun ammunition in my foxhole with me, but the machine gun was in the next foxhole. And I crawled over to it real quick, gathered up the machine gun, and there was 2 boxes in that. Brought it back to my hole because that was the closest to the river. And I loaded the machine gun and started firing the machine gun. And you would think with a machine gun that you would be able to whittle down the odds a little bit. But the more I fired, the more people seemed to keep massing on the riverbank. That's what it looked like on the riverbank, looking over there. That many people and more were waiting to come across to kill me. So, you know, it's real frightening. You know, when you've shot and shot and shot and shot and shot, and you look up and there's still that many. You know, and you're thinking, well, am I not hitting them? Or, you know, you're trying, and you never quit shooting, so all this is going on in your head. You know, what am I doing wrong? Or what am I doing right? Or, so I kept doing my job as I was trained to do. Fired the M60 machine gun until I ran out of ammunition with it. I melted the barrel. My sergeant that was shot in the chest, I thought was dead. 6 years ago, we had a reunion. He lives in Lansing, Michigan today, and he's not in great health, but he's still here. After we got past the hugs and the kisses, I had to tell him that I had thrown my machine gun into the river that night, because that, you know, you don't let the enemy get the machine gun. It's the little things like that that sometimes stick with your mind. And I remember I kept thinking that somebody was behind me shooting, and because I could see a tracer go right across my barrel. And in fact, what had happened was that I had melted the barrel to the point that there was actually a hole in it. And now the rounds that weren't tracer, I don't know how many of them were flying out, but you could see the tracers going out of the side of the barrel. But I kept firing. And when I ran out of ammunition, I threw the machine gun into the river, and still they were just massing. Still they were coming. And I thought, well, at that time I thought I was the only one left alive. Because of the din of the battle going on around you and my reduced hearing ability, I couldn't tell that anybody behind me, which was supposedly my guys, I couldn't tell that anybody behind me was firing. I looked at my howitzer, and it was on fire and burning. The wheels were burning. The recoil mechanism was blown off of it. It just looked in terrible shape. But I thought, well, if I'm going to go down, I'm not going to go down easy. So I thought I could fire if I could just get one round off. So I crawled over to my gun, found a beehive round, which looks just like that, except it's I think it's red around it instead of blue, and it does have beehive painted on the side of the round. Our sergeant, who I thought hated me, I thought he hated all of us, had made us set during the daytime when we were not firing. Now this would have been for the whole series. I'd been there for 6-7 months. He had made us blindfold ourselves and set the time fuse on them 105 beehive rounds. And you could very plainly look down and see, they got marked off in increments. Has to do with seconds, how many seconds out of the tube it blows up, and you could set it all the way to 7 miles. Well, if a round would have went off 7 miles away that night, it would have done me no good. So I knew I had to set it on muzzle action, which is MA. And if you don't take it far enough, or if you take it too far, well, then it goes off someplace else rather than where you want it. And that old sergeant had made us sit there during the day with blindfolds on and set the fuses to muzzle action by counting the clicks. You could feel it going click, 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 click. And we could think of absolutely no reason at all why this mean old man, he was 27, why this mean old man would make us blindfold ourselves and sit there when everybody else was doing other things and set these fuses to muzzle action. Well, that night when I crawled over to my howitzer, and the first thing I wanted to find was a beehive round, and when I picked it up, my hand immediately started going click, 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 and I knew where to stop. You know, I didn't have to stop and think, well, now did I count 19? Did I count 27? You know, it was automatic. And it was that second when I knew that that old sergeant who had been to Vietnam before didn't hate me. That actually, I think maybe he loved me. He loved me enough to be strict and stern. I mean, he was never cruel or unjust, but I thought he hated me. So I loaded that 105 beehive round, and the next thing that I needed was a canister, which you can see the canister sitting there. That wasn't fired. Now, we had everything all stacked up real nice and neat, but when all the mortars and the incoming started hitting it, well, it scattered everything. So the good canisters that were unfired were mixed in with the canisters that were fired, and I could feel it's got a little primer on the back end of it, and you can feel it with your finger if it's fired or not. It's got a little bit of a bubble to it. So I was crawling around finding a canister. Finally, I found a canister that felt like it was a good canister, fireable. And I grabbed it. Next thing I needed was powder. Well, all of our powder had been burnt, blowed up. Those bags that we had cut charges with and laid the powder bags aside had been hit, but they had not burnt. And the powder looks like hog feed. Looks like, you know, just like little hog pellets, if y'all know what hog feed looks like. So I could feel it on the ground, so I was scooping it up, and it was real wet and muddy, but I was scooping it up. And another thing that our sergeant had taught us was the fact that you always have to fire beehive at charge 7, which is maximum charge, for it to be effective. I mean, you don't want it going out and going bloop, and, you know. So I was trying to make sure that it was a maximum charge. Well, what I failed to realize, that a canister full of loose powder is much, much more than 7 bags. I mean, even when they're in bags, they don't come, you still got about this much room from the top because you have to set the round down in it. But I filled that sucker plumb full of loose powder. And then I loaded it behind the round and closed the breech block. And when I looked to see where the howitzer was firing, it was off to the left of where they were massing at that time to come across and get me. And I knew that we had to pick the howitzer up and move it. Normally it's a 4-man job when it's in mud and adverse conditions, and that's with the tires up. Well, the tires were blowed off of it, but I was properly motivated. And I laid one trail on my shoulder, and I was pretty close to the breech. In fact, I was almost underneath the breech, and picked it up and laid my hand on this breech, or on this trail, and had this one on my shoulder and was moving it around. I mean, I didn't do this in seconds. It did take me a few minutes to get it up and get it moved. But I could see parts of this trail over here just disappearing. I couldn't really hear anything. I could feel the vibration of when, you know, it would be, felt like it was, the gun was starting to vibrate, and then a piece would fly off. And it wasn't until I seen a big tracer go on past that I realized that there was a 50 cal set up directly across from me, and they were firing at 50 cal at me trying to move that howitzer, and it was bouncing off of it, and tracers was going everywhere. which motivated me even more. And finally, I got it to where I thought it was going to do the most good, and I let it drop. And by that time, the 50 cal was really bearing down on me, so I tried to hide underneath it, get the wheel hub. That was the heaviest or the thickest piece of metal that I could think of between me and where the 50 cal was. So I was hiding underneath the howitzer with the lanyard. It's a rope with a little ball on the end of it, so it doesn't slip out of your hand. Underneath the howitzer, waiting for the NVA to mass. And when they had accumulated enough that I thought it would do the most good, I pulled the lanyard, and the round went off. Because the howitzer was way overcharged, and because the recoil mechanism was blown totally off of it, instead of just going, boom, like that, it jumped back on its trails and stood straight up in the air. And this is an awesome sight, which I didn't get to enjoy that, but the guys that were alive behind me said they heard this god-awful noise. And when the powder's wet, it breathes a lot of fire when you fire it. They said they heard this god-awful noise, and it looked like a flamethrower. And then the howitzer stood up on its trails, which has got to be 30 foot high, and then fell back down. And when it fell down, well, it fell on me, because I'd been hiding underneath it. But it bounced, and when it bounced, well, you kind of instinctively rolled out of the way. It broke my back and crushed my ribs on the right side. But when I looked across the river, you could see the path that the beehive had mown through the enemy. And I thought, well, maybe I can get off one more round. So I went through all that process again and found another round and got it loaded. And by that time, well, they had started swimming across the river at me again. And I fired another, but this time I rolled out of the way. And I didn't charge it quite as full. Each gun is issued 10 beehive rounds, and I fired all 10 rounds. Fired a couple HE, high explosive, fired at least one white phosphorus marking round. The last round that I fired was a propaganda round, which looks just like that, but it's hollow, and it has a little subcharge in it that pops it open, and these leaflets come falling down. And you fire that over a known enemy position, and in this instance it was Chuhoi notes, which I believe means come home free, which is very effective on it psychologically, to fire it over an enemy position when they think they've hidden in the jungle, and you pop one of these over and these leaflets come flying, floating gently down. Well, that night they didn't float down so gentle because I was firing them direct fire at about 40 yards. But it served my purpose well. During that process of me firing, several times I had heard someone say, "Don't shoot, I'm a GI." Well, that was a known ploy that they used because most GIs, if you hear somebody shout in English, "Don't shoot, I'm a GI," what you going to do? Right? I mean, that's you don't shoot, I'm a GI. You get up to look and see who it is or what it is. And we had fallen victim to that a couple times. So I had basically ignored it. And towards the end of when I was firing the howitzer, I heard the plea, and I looked from behind the howitzer, and an illumination flare popped right over the other bank. And I could see a black man standing there. So I knew that he was my brother. And I said, that's when somebody's got to go get him. And I felt that I was the only one left alive. So that's when I grabbed the air mattress, and that 50 cal I'd been working on, it had holes blown all in it. But I found an area that I thought would probably hold some air, and I blew it up with enough air that I thought would hold us. And I made my way across the river. Now, they're still massing and running across. The battle was nowhere near over. Made it to the other side of the river, stashed my air mattress underneath some bushes along the river and made my way back to where the last place I'd seen Gwendell. And when I arrived at this bush, expecting to, when I crawled around it to find Gwendell there was a foxhole. And instead of just one man, there were 3 men in the foxhole. Gwendell Holloway, Billy Ray Crawford, and Jim Deister. Billy Ray had his left foot shot off. Gwendell was shot in the back and had a shrapnel wound to his head. Jim Deister had a bullet, went right through his head, went in one ear and came out the other ear. Also had a chest wound. And I knew that I didn't have the physical strength left to make 3 separate trips, because by that time I'd lost a lot of blood. So I made the decision that it was either all or none, that I'd either bring all of them back or we'd all die there. And I picked up Jim Deister, which was the most severe one. In fact, we thought he was dead. We had checked for vitals, couldn't get anything, but I wasn't going to leave him. So I picked him up and slid him up on my back with his head like hanging down here where I could see if he was, going to fall off. And I picked up Billy Ray and I picked up Gwendell. They were smaller than me, thank goodness. And we started making our way back to the riverbank. Well, Gwendell had his M16 and had 3 or 4 clips left of his 16. And the reason that he still had ammunition was he was right in the middle of where the NVA were coming down. And it was not good that if he had stood up and fired, they'd have killed him, and besides that, killed the men that he was with. So he made the decision, being as he was hidden in the foxhole, to remain there until help could come. So that's why he still had ammunition. I had his M16, and several times I had to lay the guys down and fire the M16 to clear a path for us to get down through. After I run out of ammunition, found a big limb, and we'd lay there, and I had to rest too. So we'd lay there and we'd watch them come running past us. And they were just young kids like we were, 19, 20 years old, maybe some younger. And most of them were doing what their sergeant had told them to do. They said, hold your weapon at port arms, run to the riverbank, sling arms, swim across the river and kill the Yankees on the other side. And that's what they were doing. And they would run right past us, and they would see us laying there, but it's like, well, they were scared, just like we were. And they were, they were just doing their job. But several of them, you could tell that they recognized us. And those that recognized us, well, then I had to have a response. And that's when I would shoot them when we had ammunition, or club them when I had run out of ammunition. Finally, we made it back to the riverbank, put Mr. Deister, the man the most seriously wounded, on the air mattress first, and made my way across the riverbank. When I got to the other side, Bill Murray had come down to the riverbank, and he helped get Jim Deister up out of the river, and I went back across to get the other remaining men loaded. They could hold on. Gwendell and Billy Ray could both hold on. So it was a lot easier, and swim back across. Now, they were shooting at us, and, they were doing their job. Made it back to the riverbank. Again, Bill jumped in the river and met me a little ways out and helped get the other 2 men to the riverbank. And I remember after Bill took the 2 guys out of my custody, and I was just so tired, and I hurt so bad. And I just relaxed. And I could feel myself floating down in the river, and the water felt so cool, and it was quiet. And I thought, well, I've done my job the very best that I could do it. And I thought that I was just willing to die. I was so everything. I was so tired, so everything. And the cool of the water was like heaven, because when you get shot, it burns real bad. And the deeper I sank, well, the better it felt. I just remember relaxing for the first time in hours and hours and hours, and how great it felt. We'd been throwing our canisters after we'd fired them into the river, a lot of them. And that was the first thing that my feet felt, was some of our canisters laying down on the bottom. And just like that, it was instinct to kick off and go back up and get a breath of air. And when I came up to the top, well, I said, well, I'm not done yet. So I made my way to the bank, crawled up on the bank. In crawling back towards the next artillery piece that was still functioning, I crawled up to my sergeant, which I thought was dead. And he had a sucking chest wound. Means it was into his lung cavity. And when they teach you about how to repair a sucking chest wound, it states that you, or at least the man that taught us, says you get your poncho and you cut a section out of it, because the poncho is rubberized, or I guess they're still rubberized, and you lay it across the sucking chest wound, and then that seals it off, and then the man can breathe again. Because I was so tired, I was kind of on automatic. And the instructor had said, your poncho. Well, there were probably other ponchos laying around, but I crawled back to my original position, found my duffel bag, which was all blown to hell. Well, it was. Got my poncho out of it and tore me a piece, which had holes all in it. But I brought my poncho back and put on my sergeant's chest. And when I got back, well, he raised his hand up. And this is the man that I thought hated me, you see. He raised his hand up, and I grabbed a hold of his hand. I lay there beside him for a minute, holding his hand. And then I thought he was trying to say something, and I got up kind of over him, and I could look right down into his soul. And that's when I realized that he loved me. And I gave him a kiss. Drug him back to a safer position. Because our medics had been hit also, we had the responsibility of administering aid to our wounded. We had had the opportunity to give shots and stuff like that, tracheotomies, in the past, so it wasn't something real new. When you give somebody a morphine shot, you dip your finger in the blood and put a mark on their forehead. And so that way, if somebody else crawls across them, they see a finger mark, well, then they know that they've had at least one shot of morphine. We had lots of morphine, and I administered as much of it as I thought was practical to our men. Then joined a gun. We had two pieces that were still able to fire until the battle broke about 8 o'clock in the morning. Then we started getting dust off. Helicopters come in to take off our wounded. Mr. Deister, which I thought was dead, we had put him in the pile of the men that were dead. We had to do our own triage. Y'all know triage? Where you have to make the decision whether that man's wounds are going to allow him to survive. You know, you don't want to put somebody on a helicopter if they're going to die. Probability of dying is very great versus somebody that's going to make it. So we had to form our own triage. You had to make the decision whether this man that you'd just spent 7 months in a foxhole with was going to get on that helicopter to go back to be with his mom and dad or wife and children. And that was a real hard job to do. Very hard job to do. So after we had dusted off all the men that we thought were going to make it, then we started dusting off those that we didn't think were going to make it. Mr. Deister was one of the last men that we dusted off because he was dead. So he was with our dead. So when I got a call from him 21 years later, it was very surprising. In fact, I thought it was somebody playing a cruel hoax on me when Jim Deister called me. And we didn't wait that long on purpose. You know, it was just one of those things, well, I will do it tomorrow, or I'll call them next week, or in some cases you didn't know their real name. You know, we had guys with, you know, Ski and Skeeter and Boogaloo and you name it, and you didn't really know their real name. You remembered where they was from, and you remembered what their girlfriend's name was, on, you know, what they did on their first date, what kind of car they drive. You know, it's those things that are really important that you talk about when you're sitting in a foxhole with a man. You might start off talking about inconsequential things, but pretty soon, because you're really scared, you start talking about the things that are really important to you. And so you become very, very close with these men that you share these foxholes with. I mean, I knew men better than I knew my own brothers. So it makes it doubly hard when you see this man get shot and he's laying there dying. It's not just a casual acquaintance. You know, you love this person sometimes more than you love your own brothers, your blood brothers at home. But we all did our job. We all did our job. And because all of us never quit trying, we didn't lose. Out of the 42, there were 12 of us left the next morning. Out of the 1,500 NVA, there's varying accounts. You'd have to understand the military at that time. I know in front of my piece, they were 5 deep for as far as I could see. Young soldiers that were doing their job. I just happened to be a little bit better trained, a little quicker, a little bit more determined maybe. But I did my job. All that I did to earn this medal. I've never been an overly brave man or an overly brave young person, but I've always been real determined. And that's what carried me through that night, was the love that I had for my fellow man and my determination to do my job, no matter what. I would have rather died than to have not done my job. Do you understand? Well, that's where all of you all are here today, are at that, not that serious at this moment. And I pray to God that none of you ever get in that predicament. But you see, when I was in your place 30-some years ago, although Vietnam was going on, I never really thought that I would be in a situation where I would have to recall all these boring textbook days and all these things that you have to learn, and you have to know it that quick. When somebody is pointing a gun at you and is very seriously going to blow you away, you don't have the time to go, now wait a minute, I remember that. You know, you have to know it at that second. You have to know exactly what it is that your job is and what you have to do to accomplish it. So that's why these days are so important. And there again, I pray to God that none of you ever have to use it in a combat situation. But if you do your job the very, very best of your ability, and love that person next to you, and take care of them. And none of you wait 21 years before you give that man or woman a call. That's one of the lessons that I've learned. Any questions? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Be honored to, sir. Thank you, son.
Thank you very much.
I'd take a hug, too. Thank you, sir. If there's any questions, now's the time to ask them. There are no foolish questions. Yes, sir?
Who presented you with the
How many here seen the movie Forrest Gump? In the movie Forrest Gump, when President Johnson is putting that Medal of Honor around Forrest Gump's neck, that's me standing there. They used my original film footage, simply took my likeness off, put Tom's face there. So this is the actual medal that was presented to Forrest Gump. I do a lot of speaking into schools, and all the kids go, "Whoa, that's cool, dude." And it is. Any more? Yes, sir.
Sergeant Davis, what was the extent, after everything was said and done, what was the extent of your injuries?
I had 30 beehive in my, where was Forrest shot? In my buttocks. I had a AK-47 in my right thigh. My back was broke, fourth lumbar. Ribs were crushed on the right side. Various fragmentation wounds, mostly on my right side. But it didn't stop me from doing my job. You don't lose till you quit trying. I always wondered what it felt like to get shot. I mean, I worried about it, but I didn't let it worry me to the point that I, and when I got shot, well, it knocked me down, and I looked down at it, and I thought, well, that wasn't that bad. And I got up and continued on. What I didn't know at the time, that was because my back was broke, it didn't paralyze me, but it did numb me from my belly button down. Thank God, man above taking care of me, I guess, because it hurt, but it didn't hurt that bad. I continued on. Next question. Yes, sir. If there's anything that I could have done different, what would I have done? I would have liked to had more knowledge about everything. You look back on the situation now, and maybe if I'd have been a little bit smarter, I wouldn't have blowed the hole outside the machine gun. Or maybe I would have been able to done something different, that I would have been able to do my job better and saved more lives, ended it quicker. I don't know. There's some young men that died that night that if I knew what I know today, back then, while they were still alive, I'd have given them a hug and told them I loved them. Because that's something that you can't do after they're gone. And I did love those men. Because it was the macho thing not to, you didn't really do a lot of hugging. And if you notice, I do hugging today. Hugging's what keeps me going. So I think of all things, that's probably what I would do, is tell some brave young men what I thought of them and how much I respect them for the job that they did that night. Because of what they did, I'm still alive too. Yes, sir?
What did you do when you returned from Vietnam?
When I came back from Vietnam, my job in the military was to go around and talk to the colleges and universities. My wife and I was recently in Berkeley. In June of '68, the military sent me to Berkeley to speak to the student body. Berkeley was the hotbed of anti-Vietnam protests and everything. That's where they were the most active. And I had to give a canned speech, which someone in the Pentagon had written out a paper, and I could not vary from that. I had to say what was on that paper. And basically it was how great Vietnam was, how true our purpose So it was very, very hard for me to stand up in front of 15 to 25,000 young people that were actively protesting me being there and tell them how great Vietnam was. It was probably the hardest job I've ever done in my life, was to stand there dressed just like I am now and have young people who at that time were demanding freedom. You know, see, this is the greatest expression of freedom that there is to stand up and protest those that have been over and earned their freedom. So on one hand, it made me very angry that there were people that were protesting me and the men who had died for their right to stand up and protest. But on the other hand, it made me proud that we had helped earn this freedom that they were enjoying so much. Sometimes those that demand the most freedom are those who have earned it the least. So when my wife and I went back, and I spoke in San Francisco, actually, it brought back a lot of memories. But as hard as it was, it helped make me whatever I am today. That experience helped make me part of what I am. It helped teach me temperance and control of my temper, patience. Because when I came back from Vietnam the first few years, I was not a patient man. I was actually pretty angry and violent, wasn't I, Peggy? I didn't take any, people didn't harass me very long. But after I got done speaking to all these colleges, because it was my job to stand there and to deliver this canned speech and then to whatever they wanted to give back, it was my job. I learned patience and understanding. And it's okay that people protest war. You know, when nobody's there to protest a war, then we've pretty well lost as humankind is concerned, as I feel. There should always be somebody there to protest war. Now, what they should understand, the difference between the war and the warrior. Never protest the warrior. Go protest the politicians that sent that warrior there. That's understandable, or at least in my book I understand that. Don't protest the warrior. And that's what they were doing during the Vietnam era. They were taking out all of their frustration on the person who had been sent there to do their job, and that's all we did was our job. Next question. Yes, sir.
So after the first 21 years you heard from Mr. Baxter, how was your reaction and his reaction to him? Voice of him?
Yes, sir. I was on a speaking tour in Florida, and my wife called and said, Jim Deister called, and I've given him your number in Florida. So he called, and Mr. Deister's deaf. He was the man shot through the ears, speaking through an intermediary, and said, well, Mr. Deister is one of the men that you swam across the river for 21 years ago. And I'm thinking, somebody's playing a cruel hoax. But I didn't want to say anything, so I said, oh, is that right? Yes. And we talked for a few minutes more and said, well, he would like to meet with me. And I said, well, that would be excellent. Mr. Deister lives in Salina, Kansas. And in 2 weeks from that point, we were going to be in Nebraska for the Nebraska Vietnam Veterans Reunion. So I suggested to Mr. Cole, who was speaking for Mr. Deister, I said, why don't you bring Mr. Deister up to the Nebraska Vietnam Veterans Reunion, and then I'll be able to talk with you there. And they thought that was a good idea. So I hung up the phone, and then for 2 weeks, well, I kind of, thought, well, Mr. Deister's dead. I know he's dead. I loaded him on the helicopter. When we walked into the Holiday Inn and wherever it was, Grand something or other, Nebraska, and I seen Mr. Deister was standing at the check-in counter, and as soon as I seen him, well, I knew it was the real Mr. Deister. And we were there for 4 days, and I don't remember doing a lot of talking with him because he's deaf, but I remember holding hands a lot and a lot of hugging. Got to meet his granddaughter. It's awesome to hold a little baby in your arms, knowing that if you had not done your job, that child wouldn't be there. You know, a lot of mornings when I get up out of bed and my body hurts and I'm stiff, her name's Amy, and I'll think of Amy, and it makes it okay. It's cool. Next question. Are we done? Are y'all ready to graduate?
Yes, sir.